Welcome to Being Human. I'm your host, Steve Cuss. On Being Human, we explore the dynamics that infect all of our relationships, not just our relationships with fellow humans, but also our relationship with ourself, which is often the most elusive relationship. We don't always think that we're in relationship with ourselves, and so we then get disconnected. We get infected by reactivity and triggers, and it makes life harder. But also our relationship with God. When you are in the grip of anxiety or reactivity, the first thing to go away is awareness of God's presence. That's why every week on the show, we pause and we light a candle, because God is light and in him there is no darkness at all. And we just take this little breather to relax into God's presence, become human sized, where we can notice God and go about our day. So let's light that candle now. If you're a follower of Jesus and you also follow the news, I would imagine you're pretty fed up with church scandals. When some leader of some kind is discovered to have either a secret life or that they're abusive, or maybe they've been having some kind of duplicitous situation. Just this week, another Christian leader was exposed. You can Google this person. I'm not going to name names. But in this particular case, he was setting up duplicate fake social media accounts so he could bully people online. Went pretty hard after some people. His board first confronted him about this a while ago. He completely denied it. And then it became irrefutable evidence. And finally, after being cornered, he confessed to it, and now he's stepped down. And here we are. The board has released a statement. And I think we're all weary, aren't we, of these situations? And a few things strike me about this. First of all, most of these people that get caught, they're in their 40s to 60s in age. Some of them a little older, some a little younger. But most of them are in that 40 to 60-something-year-old window. And in my field, I think what's going on is their coping mechanisms are no longer working for them, whether they're keeping it hidden or whether they're coping in some way, they're kind of running into themselves. But also for these people, very few of them, I think maybe none of them, got into ministry to mistreat people. They got into ministry because they wanted to further God's kingdom. They wanted to proclaim the good news of Jesus. And somewhere along the way, they lost sight of the gospel and they depended on themselves. And I guess I'm always haunted by these stories. I think I have a holy fear of making sure that I'm well, that I'm paying attention to my own coping mechanisms, the ways I depend on myself when I'm not depending on Jesus. When I saw the news, a good friend of mine, Chuck DeGroat, posted on social media about it. And Chuck is one of those people, if you're not familiar with him, he's one of those people that I want to hear from in these situations. Chuck is a pastor. He's a therapist. He actually specializes. He does these amazing soul care intensives for people who have burned out or people who have gotten caught and they come in for help. Chuck is the executive director, not just a counseling professor, but an executive director of a whole program of counseling at Western Seminary. He's written a number of books, and they're all circling around the topic of being well, being an integrated person, whether his topic is more proactive, like his wonderful book, Wholehearted, or whether it's more responsive, like his book, When Narcissism Comes to Church, or whether it's holistic, like his most recent book, Healing What's Within. So when the news broke of this person and I saw Chuck's post, I just reached out and said, hey, can we scramble and put an episode together? And we had a conversation, both of us sharing pretty vulnerably about our own foibles, our own challenges, what it was like when we ran into ourselves. But I started just by reading to Chuck what he posted on social media as we talked about another fallen church leader. Let's tune in now. Okay, so I'm just minding my own business on Facebook, and I see a post from someone I profoundly respect, who's also a dear friend, Chuck DeGroat. And this is what he posted just a couple of days ago, and I immediately said, Chuck, I'd love to find a way to squeeze you in and chat. Chuck said, another day, another fallen pastor, it seems. discovered to have run multiple anonymous social media accounts slandering others. People are already wondering how long it will take to write the apology, take a sabbatical, come back with a book deal, a manifesto on grace and forgiveness. We need to not only talk about consequences in these situations, we need to begin having a larger conversation about character. Tell us what was behind that post, first of all, Chuck.
Well, I know you're deeply invested in this, and I'm invested in this, and I think part part of our work uh, at times is to step back behind the crises and to ask what's really going on here. And so it was an opportunity to sort of uh, name a particular moment. We don't have to name the particular pastor who was caught. It seems like every other day there's some sort of situation like that, but they often play out in similar ways. To take a step back and while people are talking about consequences, he should be out of ministry for a year, 5 years, 10 years, and to ask, well, how is character formed in the first place? And uh, if there is to be character reformation or reformation, what does that look like? And so that's what I was teasing there is a little bit of a sense of what would it look like for us to step back and have a larger conversation about character, because we maybe could talk about this a little bit more. So often, I think these are framed as mistakes. I shouldn't have done that. And The reality is there are mistakes. I mean, there. I think about time in a faculty conversation here that we were having, where I just got reactive, and I didn't like how I showed up. Um, I don't. I think most people who know me would say that that doesn't represent your character. You're so consistent, but uh, we were going through some things with our girls. They were a little bit younger at that time. I was having a bad day, and I showed up in a way that I wasn't thrilled about. Right, but we're not talking about these one-off mistakes. We are talking about people who sort of show us who they really are when these behaviors are revealed, right? That are not merely one-off behaviors; they're habits that have developed over time and have I mean, in this case, with this person who had multiple social media accounts, and this had played out over time and took some intentionality. You know, this isn't just I had a bad night. This is I. It took time to create other identities, you know, and then to engage in these ways actively as if you're engaging from these other identities. So that's something that we need to begin to sort of step back and think about, even while people on the ground are talking about, well, what do we do now in terms of accountability and discipline?
Okay, so this particular guy, it was quite a willful, to your point. Like he went out of his way to commit this. Plus, I believe it was 2 years before he got exposed, his board approached him because people had been accusing him of this behavior, and his board, he point blank, bold faced lied to his board. They were always suspicious by the look of it the whole time. This often happens, right, Chuck? Is the people around the perpetrator? Let's call him for now a perpetrator. The people around the perpetrator are smelling it and they're saying something's off. But what happens next? Is it the power dynamics that it's hard to then push someone, or you can't prove it?
Yeah, there are 1,000 micro behaviors, right, that people are sensing and seeing. And this often happens in cases of harm and abuse in the church. But yeah, I think oftentimes, particularly for us, you and I are both ordained ministers, right? When we've gone to seminary, we've got the robe and the stole and the clerical collar and the degree and the rev before our names, and we've got the power to get up on stage and communicate with authority. Thus says the Lord. You know, we've got all these things that amount to a kind of power that I do think when lay people, you know, boards, elders, hear about these kinds of things, they give us the benefit of the doubt because we are ordained. We've gone through a process. There has been some sort of accountability. We didn't get here overnight in most cases. Some do. And so, yeah, I think that there's a deference to to the power, to the authority. And that looks different in different circumstances, right? And in particular kinds of systems, there really is a sense that I am the lead pastor. And I'm up here, and you all peons are down here, But even in more flattened organizations, you see this play out too.
So, as you and I've chatted, I'm very early in a doctorate, and what I want to chase is the idea. It's a very simple idea that the only way humans can grow is when we are human sized. And I think human sized isn't a tightrope of eggshells. I think it's quite a broad range. But there's two extremes. On the right of human size is pretense or pretentiousness. I'm going to put up a manufactured image, and that's what you're going to see. And then on the other extreme is protection. I'm not safe to be my fully myself, and so on micro levels, you might see protection playing out. For example, in the Me Too movement, when these men are grooming these women, and these women are like laughing their way to safety, they're trying to protect themselves, get smaller. Um, and I'm fascinated by the idea that how quickly we all revert to our coping mechanisms without realizing it, like they're an autopilot response. So I want to throw something at you and get your reaction to it. I came into ministry pretty afraid. Like, so my childhood and teenagehood, I felt very stupid. I felt like the world was tilted away from me to where I just couldn't even get the stamina to run uphill. And then what happened after high school, I became a very successful, to my great surprise, salesperson. So, and this should not surprise you, Chuck, as we know each other, but in high school and elementary school, terrible grades, didn't know how to talk to a girl, terrible athlete. That's all there is in school, is making someone laugh, getting good grades academically, or being a good athlete. And I just couldn't do it. So I left school. I sensed a call to ministry. I needed money for Bible college, so I started selling, and I shoot to the top of all of the sales awards. And then for the next 3 years, I was a salesman, and then 3 years in Bible college, I swing wildly into arrogance and super confidence, not realizing I'm just covering my fear. And then my journey is that I went from Bible college to chaplaincy. And so I brought all that confidence and arrogance into chaplaincy. And my peer group and my supervisors were the first people not just to see through my pretense. I'm sure others saw through my pretense, but they pointed it out and held it up in my face in a very aggressive way. And it was extremely threatening to me, because I think when you don't know you're pretentious and somebody sees it, and then as soon as they show it to you, you now like, you're like, oh, I am like,
Yeah.
this kind of blind spot knowledge. So I battled them for 12 weeks before I actually realized these people love me. They are the first people in my life to show me my, I don't know what the Christianity Today word for it is, my ass. And that changed my life. So let me just pause there and get your reaction to that, and then I want to take some of these fallen pastors and bring them back to
Yeah.
that situation.
I think you use the language of coping mechanisms, but you were describing coping mechanisms in the midst of some insecurity, right? It's comfort that goes way back, and I think for many of us, that's where the story begins. Is there's a version of us that we feel kind of insecure or young or missed or misunderstood, or we don't quite fit in, or we'll never be the athlete, or I don't have the grades. And so we find a way to evolve in a sense, right? And this often happens in unwitting ways, unconscious ways, right? Developmentally, it just seems to work. We shift from sixth grade to seventh grade, as I did, into middle school, and suddenly they're a new group of friends, and so I can try out some new things with them, and put on a new personality. And I do think that as this evolves, the person we become, the persona we become, to use a Jungian word, is the only version of us that we know after a while. So we are the person who shows up on the platform with some charisma. We are the person who can close the sales deal. We are the person who leads with some sense of courage or competence or confidence, right? But lingering beneath all of that is that young, insecure, uncomfortable, unsure, misunderstood little boy, and I think oftentimes that persona can only work for a while. The coping mechanisms can only work for a while. This is often why these things blow up in midlife at some point, or
Yeah.
when we're under stress, right? Because it's like there's something that we've left behind that needs to be looked at, that needs to be retrieved. There's some sort of developmental work that has been left undone. And in my work, your wife's a therapist, and you're engaged in this kind of work a lot too. We often find that as the conversation opens up, there's some sense of like, where did I lose myself along the way? I became this person and it worked for me for a while, and I climbed the ladder and I had some success, right? But I think that's what I hear in your story. And then a moment where you had an opportunity to ask the question, a mirror was placed before you and you had the opportunity to ask the question, who have I become? Who do I want to be? And those are really critical moments for us.
There were two, in that particular chaplaincy year, there were two pivotal moments. The first was the chaplain supervisor, just a couple of weeks in, there were six residents, six students, and two supervisors. A couple of weeks in, he nicknamed me Super Chaplain. And I was like, oh, yes, I didn't realize he's mocking me. I really thought he was like saying, Steve, you're so good at this.
Yeah.
How amazing. You've never done it before. You're only 24. Look at you go. And I said, oh, thank you. And then everyone laughed. It was really embarrassing. And he said to me, Steve, what's interesting about you, you're actually naturally good at a lot of things. He said, I don't know if it's because you're Australian or what it is, but you just have this kind of natural broad competence. And then he said to me, Chuck, he said, it must be so exhausting trying to show us all the time. It's like, oh, and the second he said it, I was like, oh my goodness, that is true. And then the other experience I had is I presented my family of origin. We all took turns presenting our genogram family of origin. And the Cuss family propaganda is that we are better than others. We know better. We have the final word. We're like the Pope. And the sudden realization, oh, I get to be from a dysfunctional family like everyone else. How freeing. I don't have to. So I shudder to think of, okay, if I hadn't had the context of death and suffering, which kind of dislodges all this pretense, and then this incredibly loving group, I really am terrified of who I would have become. Well, first of all, your take on that, and then I want to go back to our call from God and get your take
Yeah,
on
you said
something
something
there.
really important there. That there's this role that suffering plays that doesn't maybe completely cure us of pretense, but it certainly draws us back to the ground. It's humiliating. It's which at its core, the word is humus, right, of the earth. It brings us back down to the earth, to the ground of our being. And I think what's interesting is I'm doing, as you know, some writing on character formation right now, and there are these initiatory traditions, non-Western ancient initiatory traditions, not anything to emulate, like I'm talking about throwing boys in alligator infested waters, to teach them how to become men. But there's a principle there, and you see it in scripture too, where it takes a wilderness to form us, 3 days in the belly of the whale, moments of pain, moments of suffering, moments of feeling like, where is God? What Walter Brueggemann calls disorientation, as he talks about psalms of disorientation. Like these are really formative. I think what I find in my work is that many of us were taught to run from that, because that successful face, that more confident and bold me that I'd learned to be, well, that's working. I remember for me in the '90s, the late '90s, when I was about to go off and do a PhD in biblical studies with a guy named Richard Bauckham, who's a kind of a big deal in biblical studies. And I thought, well, I've arrived. This is it. And a counseling professor sat me down and said, son, you need to do some significant work. And he invited me into this 2-year transformational program where I was getting immediate feedback from colleagues, professors, and supervisors who would sit before me and say, let me tell you how I experienced you. And, the part of me, the persona that had grown that was like, but I have a lot to offer the world and I'm a success and I'm pretty good academically. What they'd offer back to me is, we sit with you in a room and you don't listen very well. I co-counsel with you and you have to have the last word. I watch you interact with that woman and I see threads of misogyny. These are what I'm hearing from my peers, right? And so it blows it all up. And that's the humiliation that I'm talking about that brings us back to our humanity, I think, is some of the work that you're doing, right? Back to our humanness, our limitations, our brokenness, which is a really good place to start the character reformation project or process. But as you know, as I know, there are a lot of pastors who get found out, caught in these things, and they're not willing to go there. What they want to do is save face. They want to figure out the fastest way to take a quick sabbatical and get back into ministry without losing that sense of power, platform, prestige that they had before.
Do you think some of these guys don't know what to do with fear?
Mm-hmm.
They don't feel fear, so then therefore they can't tolerate fear, and they just have to hide
Yeah.
and blame.
I mean, fear is buried, shame is buried. I don't think they know what to do with fear. I don't know. They don't know what to do with shame. In many cases, they don't know what to do with anger. They don't know what to do with the emptiness that they feel inside, and they're when they feel it, and you could say this better than I can. I preached for 3 years only, and then I was like, I'm not a preacher. You preached a lot longer than that. But when they feel it, it's on Sunday nights or Monday mornings. That sense of you go from the grandiose high of being on the stage, the platform, to the low of now the lights have gone out. And there's this sense, I think, as I talk about in the narcissism stuff, that when you're not shining, you disappear. And who am I if I disappear? If I'm not seen. And so it's terrifying at some level. I think that's the fear that you're getting. It's terrifying at some level to not be in that place of being seen, of shining.
Chuck, in your own journey, how old were you when you discerned a call to ministry, or however you would word that?
Yeah, I went to seminary in 1995. I was 25 years old. It was 2 years later that professor sat me down and said those hard things. So I was still pretty young.
I think I was in my late 20s to early 30s when it first occurred to me that part of the reason I'm in ministry is to work out my own dysfunction. Uh, I, I sensed a call to ministry as a teenager. I'd only been a Christian a few years, and it was all for Jesus, 100% Christ and Him crucified. It was very simple. And then in my 30s, I remember thinking, oh no, what if God didn't call me to ministry? What if my dysfunction is what drew me to a stage and all of this? And then, of course, by the grace of God, I think in that wrestling, oh wait, no, God is reaching into my dysfunction, redeeming some pain for His, for stewardship. But when we have interns at our church, it's part of what we're trying to do in their 20s is show them the complex nature of their call. You're a seminary professor. What are you seeing among this generation of students and their understanding of God's call and pain and suffering and integration?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think things have shifted a little bit. Ministry isn't as sexy as it was 25 years ago, and so I think they're more aware of uh, the pain of ministry. I often talk about the reality that most pastors will likely have to be bivocational, and so they're quickly cured of this idea that I'm going to graduate and some large church is going to pursue me, and eventually I'm going to be on some platform as the pastor of a 1,000-person church or something like that. So I think they're coming in now, fewer numbers,
Yeah.
for sure. This is the big problem in seminary education and pastoral formation. But I think I'm really proud of our students who are coming in with a sense of reality. Um, think they're more aware of their own limitations. I think our young people get a bad rap sometimes. You know, we look at them and they're addicted to social media and they're the anxious generation. And but I think in some ways what I've experienced are women and men who are preparing for ministry and more acquainted with their own brokenness, more able to enter into conversations. I just completed a class with a group of students who wrote long papers about their own stories, their own pain, and the honesty is really remarkable. I used to get much more pushback to that kind of stuff 10 years ago, but they're more able to enter in. So what I'm hoping for is, you know, I think sometimes we idealize the early church. There's some good writing around what the early church was like pre-Constantine, pre-Christendom, pre-empire, right? But there is that sense that they're beginning to think about smaller church, micro church, relationally connected church, bivocational vocations. You know, I think that's important.
Yeah. So most of these public figures that are exposed seem to be in their 40s to 60s.
Yes.
Um,
Aren't we in our 40s to 60s, Steve?
we are,
I just turned 40, of course, but
yeah, we are somewhere vaguely in our 40s to 60s. Um, yeah, it makes me wonder. It's tragic for them as well. Like it's so convenient to see the bad behavior and then judge it. Um, but if it helps me to realize, okay, well, this was their coping mechanism, and I'm fascinated by, was there any chance if the people that confronted them had a different posture? Was there any chance that this person would take responsibility and own it and do the work? Part of what I want to chase in my studies is the posture of when you have to bring to somebody their behavior. How can you bring it to them that decreases the chances that they immediately armor up like they did the last 1,000 times? This may be very idealistic.
yeah, yeah, this is
Um,
so core.
do you, yeah, do you think there's a hope there?
Yeah, I think this is absolutely core. I think it's core from an attachment and nervous system perspective in the sense that we will only change when our bodies, our nervous systems feel safe, where we experience a sense of connection. I talk about a shift from a survival orientation, which nurtures our coping mechanisms, and a connection orientation, which allows us to connect and feel safe enough to be able to say, maybe I can begin to metabolize that shame that I've never really talked about or looked at, that aloneness that I've never really put words to, but I try to mitigate by uh, befriending all these people in my life who never really do become friends. And so I think it starts there. I think the other thing is that I've mentioned a couple times now this initiatory tradition, these non-Western and ancient traditions where I think oftentimes when we think about initiation, we think about what does it look like uh, uh, to invite young people, young disciples, even our kids, into an honest reckoning with the suffering of the world. But Michael Guriam did some work back in the early '90s around initiatory traditions, and he said every initiate who's to grow men and women from childhood into adulthood, manhood or womanhood, needed the experience of safety, a mentor, a community, and a story that was larger than their own. And I think that that's fascinating to me because that's what has been confirmed in through attachment theory and psychology, through what we understand about our nervous systems. You need to feel safe. You need to feel like there's a community around you and a larger story that you're embedded in, so that when you go out into the world and experience what you experience, you're held, you're seen, you're known, you feel safe enough to be able to process that. And I think for a lot of us growing up in homes where we our suffering was relegated to the shadows. I mean, my parents fought a lot, but we never talked about it. And so I really had no schema for understanding my own pain, my own suffering. They were not attuned to me. So I had to learn it later in my late 20s. But how do we from the very beginning, when we think about development, begin with safety, security, and then invite our kids into their own authenticity, into an experience of the world, out into courageous risk that will necessarily involve struggle. Um, but I think going back to what you just said, last thing I'll say is uh, if that's the developmental task from childhood, say you have someone 50 years old who has had multiple affairs and is now being invited to do the work. Let's just say that the defenses will be up. And the
Yeah.
only way that I see the possibility of character reformation is for them to experience a sense of safety. If it comes punitively, and I get accountability and things like that, there will be consequences, right?
Yeah.
But when they come into my office here, I'm not like, I can't believe you did. I realize that what's happening in this person's body, there are the behaviors that were done that were bad and harmful, but what's happening in this person's body is that he's living in a survival orientation. And my job is to create a safe space, to become to create safety, to become that elder, that mentor who begins to invite him into his own suffering, into his own pain. And that happens very carefully, very gently. But that's the only, to my mind, the only possibility of real character formation is to go back to those developmental basics.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. We do these intensives out of my house, and we usually get 8 to 12 students at a time. And some of those students have come in with their tail between their legs, having been fired for some kind of a bad behavior. And you look at what they did and the firing, and you're like, yes, that's right. You really can't be in a public Christian leadership role and do that behavior. But what's interesting is like you could snort cocaine in front of us and we would just be curious about it. We wouldn't judge it. And there is something like we have the luxury of not having to lead you when you're in our house. It's not just me. You know, you've met some of my coaches as well. And what we have discovered is it does become a form of a church because they're with a group of peers. Most of the times, these are strangers that don't know each other, peers and a coach. And so they're not just in one-on-one, they're actually exposed in a group of 5 or 6. And we've been surprised that for many of them, for the first time in their life, having the freedom for usually an hour and a half in a session to explore why they do what they do. And I don't think, you know, a governing board can do that. I don't know that you can wear both of those hats, but I do think there's an option for a board. They still have to terminate somebody. They're responsible to the organization, but they can still communicate that empathy and safety, right? Like I'm not looking to blame or judge. I'm interested in what are you holding? What has a hold of you? Do you want to be well? You know?
And I'm realizing right now, you know, you and I are stepping back and looking at the process from a wider vantage point, right? There may be some listening right now who are like, you don't realize, Stephen Chuck, the harm that was done to me, the injustice. I want blood, you know. And one thing I want to say, and I know you have of your own pain too, but when I was fired in 2003, I for 8 years before I started doing deeper work in earnest, I thought about ways to get back at. I mean, I wanted justice. Um, and so we're stepping back. I just want to honor those who are sitting here listening. Like, why are you talking about the recovery of people who've done harm? They they need justice, you know, and I get that. And at the same time, the only and I think this is the point the only way that I've really seen real repentance, it's not coerced. It doesn't come with, well, you're out of ministry for a year unless you repent. I mean, these guys are pretty good with words. And they're pretty good with what I call vulnerability,
Yeah.
FAUX. But the only way that I see the possibility of real repentance is if and when they experience safety, they begin to metabolize their own pain. They start to connect the dots. That was the coping mechanism, but there was the wound underneath. I'm beginning to see that, oh my goodness, I've been living like this for 20 years, 30 years. Look at what I've done. And they, in their own way, begin to see, well, this has had implications. I mean, I met my wife and I was doing these kinds of things. I raised my kids like this. And I perhaps you've seen this too, but I've had these experiences with men in particular who are like, my God, what have I done? And
Yeah.
that's when I begin to see, like, okay, now you're just beginning to kind of creep up to that place where you can perhaps begin to do the work of real repentance. But that takes, again, that sense of safety, that space that we create. But I get the people who are like, they just need to be fired and they need, it's understandable. I felt that for a long time too.
Oh, it's a really good word, and also for those people who have justifiable anger and hurt. I think Chuck and I would also both say yes, and also for these leaders that have done this damage, it's best for their soul not to be on a stage. That's part of the frustration, even in your original Facebook post, Chuck. When I read it, it's not cynical. What I wish your post on Facebook was cynical, because then I could say, "Oh, Chuck's just jaded." Unfortunately, it's just descriptive. It's when you're saying, like, I've worked with a number of churches where they force the leader on leave against his will and better judgment, and then while he's on leave, because he's domineering and aggressive and the staff have had enough and it's been years, and they say, you have to go on sabbatical, for sabbatical, go get help. While he's on sabbatical, he starts filming videos on how to rest. And I'm like, dude, what are
Is
you
exactly it.
doing? Like,
That
you
is
don't realize you're
exactly it.
the butt of your own joke. So for people who are saying that, yeah, I think we would both say there are so many ways to serve the Lord without attention, without a spotlight. I want to shift our conversation a little bit. There is such a temptation to look at public figures and these awful behaviors. But I remember, like the first time I exaggerated in a sermon. Now, that's not going to get me fired. That's as likely going to get me promoted. Um, but I knew it, and I woke up the next morning like, oh, wow, why did I do that? Like, it's a great story without needing to be polished up. Like, on its own, it's fine. Um, it feels like Jesus' question, do you want to be well, is the piercing question. I wonder for our listeners and viewers that aren't in a formal leadership role, we still have coping mechanisms. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes I just want to normalize that for folks. Like, we all do this. Can we just start to be honest about it? My daughter called me out for something, a story I told in my last book, and she said, "Dad, I don't think you quite got the details right. I don't think you remembered that." And I went back and I was like, "Oh, I remembered it in this kind of idyllic way, in the way that I wanted to remember it. It wasn't intentional. I didn't decide at one point to like make up a story or something like that. But I realized, like, oh, there's something about that I had recreated the memory in a way that if I were to tell a story, it sounded a whole lot more compelling, right? And I think that's where we will do these things. I mean, we're all prone to these kinds of coping mechanisms. This is what I love about those four things from the initiatory tradition. Is there a
Yeah.
mentor? Do you feel safe? Is there a community? All those four things, by the way, people would say are in AA. I don't love everything about AA, but there are a lot of people who don't feel safe in church who find their way to a basement on a Wednesday evening and they feel safe and they have a sponsor and they have a community and there's a larger story of powerlessness and healing. And so I think that's part of what we need. And when we have that, it's not happening so much now, but I sat with a group of guys every Thursday afternoon at 4. That was that space. I've got a few different spaces like that where I feel safe enough to be able to say, can I just say the thing that I don't really want to say because I'm going to be really embarrassed when I say it? That I sort of fudged this, I said it that way, and that's integrity is born out of that, that combination of our own sense of there's something off about that and the relationships that we're in. I don't know that integrity is possible without community, without relationship, right? Without being known and seen.
Yeah. The final way I want to take this conversation is for the board. Like, if you're watching or listening to this and maybe you serve on some kind of a board, Chuck, I was recently in Portugal. I was invited to speak at a conference on board governance.
Yeah.
And I kept saying, this is the least sexy church conference in the world, but it was really important. And the people who run it, I've known them for years, and they're just first class. When they put a conference together, they really know how to talk about things that matter. One of the speakers was on Ravi Zacharias' board, and Stacy is her name, and she was the youngest board member, the only one that wasn't a personal friend of his. She was not by any measure of the world a person of influence. She was basically a super fan over years, and I imagine probably a donor, and then became a board member. She became a board member 3 months before he died, and then it was 5 months when it all came out. Like, obviously there had been legitimate accusations against him while he was alive that the board had minimized and dismissed, and she shared, it was an incredible to watch her share bravely the unbelievable courage it takes to be the only one that sees it and is saying it, while the whole board is working hard to minimize you or gaslight you. Um, when I'm brought in after these situations, I've only done a handful of them. I don't have a long resume of this, but I've probably come in now half a dozen times after some kind of a situation, and I'm usually working with the board, trying to help them grapple with the micro adjustments they all made for years. So I'd love to get your take on, you referenced this earlier in the conversation. I just filed it in my head. These micro adjustments we all make to avoid dealing head on.
Yeah, I love the language of micro adjustments, and oftentimes they can be justified because goodness, he's such a good preacher, and the work is bearing fruit in our church. We're growing, and so he's a little rough around the edges. This is what I hear often. He's a little rough around the edges. We don't quite like, what happened with the human resources person and the fight that they got into, or we're kind of frustrated about his recent Facebook post, but the Lord is doing something in our church, right? And here, this is where spiritual abuse is more complicated than emotional abuse. Or we're in a fraught space because there's power, but it's like power in spiritual steroids, And so, I do think for a lot of board members, there is this kind of slow awakening to, I didn't see that. I didn't quite see it in the way that I should have seen it. And I was maybe sort of enamored by him, or I was so grateful to be asked to be on the board that, I didn't want to ruffle any feathers. And I think to flip that too, I hear a lot of pastors nowadays saying, I know I do a lot on social media, and I post these pictures, and I've got these books out and stuff like that, but I'm accountable to my board, and I can count on my board to be really honest with me. And sometimes I'm like, can you really? Are they really going to sit down with you and say, too many selfies? And I'm just wondering what's going on with that. Why 70% of your posts are about you? I think that those conversations often go something like this. Oh, brother, I'm so proud of you. God is doing such great things through your life. I'm glad you're writing books, and may the Lord be with you in your continued work. I mean, I think that's kind of the way it goes sometimes. And so I do think we need to reckon with these dynamics on boards. And I think it takes a certain kind of maturity and differentiation. As you know, we could probably have a whole conversation about that. To be a board member who is able to who knows himself or herself well enough to do that differentiating work, to say, I can step in and say the hard thing. But that's really rare in my experience of working with boards.
Yeah, I'm listening to what you're saying, and the other phrases that come to mind are things like, well, nobody's perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's just John, stuff like that. That's just his way. The other dynamic I think is vital for our audience is what tends to happen, and this isn't just in board and leader relationships. I've run into this a lot in marriages, friend groups. You make these micro adjustments for months and years, and then you get more and more clarity that it's not healthy. You're like, it shouldn't be this way. What's going on? But then you say to yourself, but it's been 10 years. It's not fair to change it now. There's that dynamic of well, we've put up with it so long, it's now what we do. And then I think there's the other dynamic. I'm grateful to Jimmy Kahns, one of my coaches, who taught me this, where Jimmy said, by the time you get clarity, you don't have the emotional gas in the tank to deal. You're kind of worn out. So you now see the problem and you're like, how did I put up with this for so long? Why didn't I do something sooner? But you're so depleted, and it takes tremendous emotional gumption, or, Friedman would call it, it just takes nerve. I've had some success in helping people go to the primary anxiety generator and say, there's two problems here. One is your behavior, but the first problem is how long we've let you get away with it. And that's on us. Like, I have not honored you. I have not respected you because I've let you get away with this bad thing. And now I'm bringing it up. And if you're feeling like a sudden whiplash, yeah, this is a whiplash. Like, but I've found it takes a lot of coaching for people to get their mind around. You can do that. It's okay. It's never Today is always the right day to stop the pattern.
Yeah, that's right. And I do think oftentimes it takes for leaders and for boards some sort of crisis moment to awaken them. I was sitting with a guy just the other day who 15 years ago I worked with, he and his board, at a church. I won't tell you where. And he looks back with a lot of regret, but is now more aware of how he got pulled in, what sucked him in, the charisma of the pastor, how it met particular needs in him for belonging, for being chosen. Board members are like, you chose me, you know, and I've watched him mature over the years. It's just that he looks back and he looks at the damage, he looks at the harm, and he's like, I played a role in that because I was enamored with this pastor and I let him get away with things that he shouldn't have gotten away with. And so I do think that that's really hard. And I think to be complicit at some level, as a board member in what happened. I know a couple of people from Driscoll's board from many years ago who felt a bit of that, and so I do think here there's a lot of there's room for gentleness and compassion. There certainly is, but I think that comes by stepping out of those roles and for a long time and getting really reflective. Like the pastor has to step away from the spotlight, from the platform, and completely, and not write books on coaching or health or rest. Or I've had those same kinds of situations, Steve. It's amazing how it happens, but completely. I mean, and it often takes a while, right? Because their bodies, I mean, they're looking back to Egypt, fawning over like, what, my life back in Egypt was so good. They have to sit in that wilderness and become comfortable with the discomfort, with the pain, and that takes people like you and me and others who do the work we do to steward those spaces of safety, to hold them, because they're going to fight and they're going to resist, and so I'm not holding them physically, but I feel that. But I need to get. The Lord has something for me to do, and say, shh. I feel the guy running away from the little boy inside of him that just doesn't want to be uncomfortable. So that's the work, and it's really important work. So thanks for what you do, and I'm grateful to be in it with you.
Well, I know you're working on a book on this very kind of nature. When is that one coming out? I think you're early in that one.
Well, I mean, I'm probably halfway through writing it. It's due this fall, and I don't know when it'll come. So it'll probably be another 9 months to a year after that. But it's felt like one that been in me since doing some of the writing on narcissism, but I needed it to cook just a little bit longer, and so. I've needed to do some research and have some conversations around it with folks that I trust and respect to vet some things. And so it's slowly emerging. But I think I took that, you read that social media post. I think I'll probably start to work it out a little bit more in spaces like that.
Do some field testing.
Yeah, in ways that are non-cynical, like you say. I mean, I don't feel a ton of cynicism around this, but I do. I have been working with it like you have for a long time, and so it feels like a conversation we need to have.
Well, just for my audience, Chuck and I are both working on this, and there are many people who are looking at these scandals, trying to get upstream. And ultimately, we would all like to produce something so that boards can notice things earlier, so that leaders, like most leaders that get into trouble, did not get into ministry so they could get into trouble. They really did. Most leaders really got into ministry to make a difference for the kingdom. So Chuck and I and several, I think, sharp people are trying to get upstream to help people in training. But also, if you're watching or listening to this, it's really not just about leaders. It's really about human flourishing for all of us. That's the whole point of this show is understanding our coping mechanisms, where we keep running into ourselves. Chuck, before we go, do you have time for a couple of gauntlet questions to
Oh
wrap us
man,
up?
it's not a podcast with Steve without the gauntlet, right? So
Well, I mean, since you are somewhere between 40 and 60, I'll just do two questions. The first one, just where do you find yourself keep running into yourself?
uh, how many places can I name? I mean, um, I was just saying to a colleague the other day who does counseling. He said, "Oh, you've been doing it for 25 years or so. You must not deal with any of the voices inside, that say you don't know what you're doing." I'm like, every damn day, I deal with those voices of, um, can I really help? Do I really know what I'm doing here? That imposter syndrome that you think will go away in your 30s, and then for sure it'll go away in your 40s. Now I'll turn 55 this summer, still hasn't gone away. That's one place. You want me to name another 35?
No, we'll take that one for now. And then, could you give us a micro habit or two that help you relax into God's goodness? A micro habit, just something that takes 1 minute to
Yeah.
10 minutes.
I mean, almost immediately when I put my hand on my chest, my clients know this. This is a form of soothing and calls me back to presence. That's a particular habit that for me is, as soon as I did that, I could almost feel myself, my body shifts. And so that's a little habit. We know from neuroscience that we need to experience feeling safe, seen, soothed, secure. It's a little bit of soothing right there that happens. And then that question that I worked with in the last book, "Where are you?" is a question I'll ask before I come onto this podcast because I want to be present. Whether I'm in a counseling session or teaching a class or on a podcast, I want to be present. So, where are you, Chuck? Those are two little micro habits.
Back in COVID, there was all this discussion about essential workers, grocery baggers, essential workers, doctors are obviously essential workers. My opinion is that Chuck DeGroat, for such a time as this, is an essential worker. He's somebody that we should be listening to, reading his work. All of Chuck's books will be in the show notes, as well as a link to his soul care intensives and his work at Western Seminary. Chuck, thank you so much for squeezing in. This was just a delightful time.
Yeah, thanks, friend. It's always good to be with you.